Welcome everyone. My name is Professor Richard Eccleston and I'm Professor of Political Science here at the University of Tasmania, and it's a pleasure to be hosting tonight's Fulbright lecture on trust in government after COVID-19. And the lecture is going to be presented by Professor Jonathan Mendilow. As you're probably aware, the lecture is part of the university's Island of Ideas program, where we're determined to keep ideas flowing during this period when we're unable to host public events live. And while I've had the pleasure of hosting a number of events at the university, including Fulbright lectures over the year, I must admit this is my first online forum, so bear with me in case there are any glitches. Firstly, as a reflection of the university's recognition of the deep history and culture of the island, I'd like to acknowledge the Palawa people as the traditional owners and custodians of the land upon which we meet, and particularly to pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I think you'll all agree that this sincere acknowledgement of country and deep commitment to reconciliation and respect, and really to end racism and discrimination and violence, is especially important given the events that we've all witnessed, both in the United States and beyond over the past week or so. As I mentioned, this is the first time I've hosted a lecture on Zoom, and I'd like to remind you of just a few housekeeping points. First of all, keep your microphone, camera, and chat function on mute while Jonathan's speaking, and he'll speak for around 35 minutes. Then using the chat or Q&A function, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions, which I'll convey to Jonathan. And finally, as you may have seen on your screen, tonight's lecture is being recorded and it can be accessed later on the university's YouTube and SoundCloud channels. Tonight's lecture is being presented in conjunction in partnership with the American Australian Fulbright Commission. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, Fulbright's a very prestigious program and indeed the largest educational scholarship program of its kind. Dates back to the immediate post-Second World War period where American Senator William J. Fulbright funded a program to promote mutual exchange and understanding. And at the moment it operates between the United States and over 155 countries worldwide. In Australia, the scholarships are funded jointly by the Australian and American governments. There's an exchange of Australians to the US and Americans such as Jonathan here in Australia. They're also funded by a range of other partners and corporations. And I had the particular privilege of being a Fulbright Fellow in 2014 and spent 3 months in Washington, DC. As I mentioned, tonight's lecture is going to be presented by Professor Jonathan Mendilow, and he is the 2020 Fulbright Distinguished Chair of Applied Public Policy here in Australia. The scholarship is funded jointly by Flinders University and Carnegie Mellon University, Australia, in Adelaide. And I'm really pleased to say that while Jonathan unfortunately isn't with us here on the island in Tasmania, he and his wife are safely in Adelaide, and he'll be giving his lecture from CMU this evening. Jonathan is Professor of Political Science at Rider University in Lawrenceville in New Jersey, a beautiful college town, I think pretty much midway between Philadelphia and New York, quite close to Princeton. He's the chair of the IPSA, or the International Political Studies Association Research Council on Political Finance and Corruption, and has published extensively in those topics over the years. His current research focuses on the very timely and relevant topic of the relationship between political finance and money in politics and the decline in trust in government. And as a Fulbright scholar, he's here in the US looking at these tendencies in Australia, how that compares with the United States, and what we can learn from that comparison. At the moment, he's just finishing his work in terms of editing the handbook on political party funding, which will be a really important contribution to that research. As we all know, I think COVID-19 has really been the ultimate test of effectiveness and authority and legitimacy of governments in living memory. And as we know, some countries have done much better in that test than others. And it's certainly something that we'll be thinking about and reflecting on for many years to come. But it's a very topical and incredibly relevant lecture that we're going to get from Jonathan tonight on trust in government after COVID-19. So I'll hand over to you now, Jonathan, for your lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'd like to begin by thanking the university for hosting me here from afar. But at least from what I see on the screen, this is a very beautiful Ireland, and I wish we would still meet on personal level. So let me begin by a small statement which seems very obvious, and that is that after the COVID-19 crisis will be gone, we'll face a deep crisis that may prolong itself for quite some time. And we'll need to make decisive, painful decisions concerning unemployment, concerning the government expenditures on healthcare that will have to be revamped, concerning wealth care, concerning the foreign debt, even concerning the situation of countries that are necessary for our economy as well as humanity, such as, say, India. So how well prepared are we to take such decisions? There are two models in political science and in the literature in general, and they come to the fore in the international debate going on today. One of them is the ability of authoritarian regimes to meet such challenges with greater success than any other forms of regime. And the reason is obvious. These are decisions that are handed from top down, and people are demanded to obey them. The second model is that there is a democratic advantage precisely because decisions in authoritarian governments are handed down top-bottom. Put it differently, the argument is that in democracy, people tend to see, whether they voted for the government or not, tend to see the government as an instrument of the people, and therefore they trust her. Once you trust, you also participate, as it were, in the decision, and the government, as well as the citizen, share in the responsibility. If you could, I've got it already. Trust, as you could see, is a psychological state. And it comprises of the intention, the future intention, to accept voluntarily whatever decision has been made because there are positive expectations concerning the intentions and the behavior of the other side, the decision-making side. Now, what we include in it is the expectation of honesty, the assumption that the other side, the side that makes the decision and we are agreed to trust, aims to serve the fulfillment of promises, or expectation at least, the fulfillment of promises, the effectiveness, and the reflection of the community itself. Again, as I said, whether or not you voted for the government, you are reflected by it until the next time around where you could vote against it. The problem right now is that, as Antonio Guterres put it, and let me quote from him, the world is experiencing a trust deficit disorder. People are losing faith in political establishments. Proliferation is on the rise. polarization is on the rise, populism is on the march. So far, Antonio Guterres. What does he actually mean? What he means is that virtually all democracies today suffer from a diminished degree of trust. And Australia, as well as the United States, are one of a kind. They too suffer from diminished trust. Let me quote something that Francis Fukuyama, the famous political theorist, wrote late last month. And that is that this being the case, because there is lack of trust in democracies as well as in authoritarian regimes, the difference between them is blurred. What will tell is trust. To what extent can either of them savor some trust, extend the trust, and that, other than other factors, will determine the fate of society as it confronts the coronavirus crisis. Now, why is it that democracies suffer from diminution of trust? And there were two main reasons that were spelled out, and most of them determined in Europe, were researched in Europe. One is the crisis, the economic crisis of 2009, 2010. And this is a crisis, an economic crisis actually began a bit earlier in 2008 and continued on a prolonged journey all the way to the end of 2009, actually to the beginning of 2010. The second argument that is being made is that parties are beginning to be alike because they lose the policy dimension. Politicians migrate to the public administration, and what is slowly being created is a professional public administration that politicians see as a destiny for themselves. There is a problem here. And the problem here is that these two explanations don't hold neither for Australia nor to the United States. The crisis of 2009, 2010 never happened in Australia. Australia is one of the countries that simply didn't go through a crisis, an economic crisis, up until actually this year. So recession is now something that has been declared, but it's just a few days ago. Until then, from the 1990s, Australia never experienced such a thing. The United States was the epicenter of a crisis, but it occurred during an electoral campaign. And in America, electoral campaigns last for a year. And the consequence of that was that the general interpretation of the crisis was that it's not a crisis at all, that it is simply a breakdown of the outgoing government. And the question will be, are we going to vote for a new president who's going to uplift the economy and save us all? And there are a few months receding in numbers until we'll pass the test. And once Obama got elected, there was a burst of optimism. Later on, it diminished, but suffice it to say, it didn't occur as far as perceptions are involved. As for the migration for public administration, Australia always had a professional public administration. America never did and still doesn't. Both factors simply don't exist here, and yet both countries suffer from a very serious economic political trust diminution. If I'm looking at one measurement of that, and that is the Edelman Global Trust Barometers, which I rely on mainly not because it's so accurate, but because it tests both countries, and whatever biases it has, it persists in both cases. In Australia, prior to the bush burning episode, where correction has been made, but just prior to that, trust in government reached 48%. Put it differently, 52% do not trust government. In the United States, the number is 49%. So in America, it's a bit better, but 1% out of 100 better in America. Now, following the bushfires, interestingly enough, no reduction in the opinion other than 2% that are attributed to the high strata of society, the most educated. Put it differently, people that do not belong to that strata did not trust the government before and continue not to trust it after. A project called Trust in Democracy in Australia, Project 2025, has continued the trends that it discerns in such barometers to the year 2025. If they persist, the argument would be, then by 2025, the number of people who trusts government in Australia will reach less than 10%. And I want to repeat that number, would reach less than 10%. There has never been any regime in the history of modern times that survived with such a percent. What we're predicting is that if trends will continue, Australia will be a very different country than we understand. What then is the reason for the diminution of trust? What can we do to shift those trends, to gain trust in the period in which we need it the most? Let me begin with United States, where it's clear, and with the breakdown of trust that occurred since 2010. The name of the factor that I'm going to mention here is Citizens United. Citizens United was a name of a complaint that was lodged to the Supreme Court of the United States by a corporation that wanted to spend money in favor of the candidate it supported. Up until then, this was not allowed in the United States, and the Supreme Court, now with a Republican majority, decided to allow it, and the reason that it gave was that spending money is equal to giving voice to opinion. No opinion should be muzzled, regardless of who expresses it, and hence corporations and the rich may add, contribute whatever sums they want to support the candidates of their choice. They're not allowed to support them directly. They're allowed to spend money in their support. The numbers that you see here are pretty obvious. In 2010, when this decision was made, just 22% of the general population has heard of it, of which 64% believe that it's a form of bribery in which rich people and corporations are able to bribe the parties and governments. In 2010, there were new entities called super PACs. These are collective coffers, if you want, into which everybody, but really the very rich and corporations, can contribute as much as they want and spend. These were local elections then, and the country has never seen signed or numbers like that that flooded the market. 54% of the population has heard about it, and 78% already said that it's a negative development, it's a form of bribery in favor of the rich. In 2014 and 15, the presidential elections began in America. It lasts for a year, the campaign, and 92% already understood what it is, and of these, 85% defined this as corruption. The upshot is that in 2019, 9 years after, when we looked at trends, in a minute I'll explain what they are, excuse me, we saw an association of government and corruption to the tone of 85%. Now, trends is the ability to correlate what people want to know concerning a subject. So if you try to find out something about government in Google or any one of those machines, you'll probably list alongside it government and what? Now, 85% of the population looked at it and said government and corruption. Now, if you remember that in the United States, the size of such a thing is 1 million a day, 1 million hits a day. That would mean that over the year, there were 365 million hits on the association between government and corruption. Now, it's true that this is not an objective number. We can't verify how many times did a person or group of people hit the same thing again and again. Not everybody has computers. Not everybody is interested. But when we deal with such a scope, then it doesn't really matter. What we could say is that around 85% of the population in the United States view their government as a form of corruption in favor of the very rich and corporations. I'd like to move to Australia here. Australia actually had a kind of Citizens United ever since public funding has been instituted, and even before, since parties began to be founded. So there are no caps on expenditure of parties. Parties define themselves what is considered donations and what are all kind of other recipes, who knows what. There are no bans on corporations to contribute as much as they want. There is no ban even on foreigners to contribute. And there are lax disclosure rules, no clear differentiation between campaign and current expenditures, that is, expenditures from day to day, say on the upkeep of the organization and things of that sort. And donors need to disclose their donation only 20 weeks after the close of financial season, normally after the elections themselves, when it is no longer relevant. In fact, contributions below $12,800 can be offered without any name whatsoever, anonymously. In the decade since 2008, a review of the two larger parties competing here showed that about 10 to 20% of the declared donations were indeed reported. 20 to 35% of whatever the parties got was gray zone. In other words, you don't know what really it is. and between 50 to 70% of what they received is unknown. I'd like to note the similarity to what has happened in the United States. Only in Australia, it happened far earlier. So why then is the decline of trust in Australia so recent? Why not ongoing kind of situation? And I think that when in December of 2008, John Faulkner introduced the Green Paper of the Australian Parliament, Federal Parliament, on the question, he defined it as best one can. What he said is that there are four main reasons that cause a doubt in the mind of a voter. One, convergence among the larger parties on economic policy. Two, the result, which is a spiraling electoral cost in effort to distinguish, to differentiate between themselves. Three, reduced number of members who are ready to join and to pay donations or contributions or membership to the political parties, and the need to gain money in order to lead such campaigns. And the consequence of that, the general conception, as is reflected in the numbers that you have here, is that the parties are for sale. Now, there is an awareness of a problem, and the very fact that I mentioned here the Parliament and its attempt to produce green papers and other papers as of 2008 is testimony to that. That awareness caused or brought about various attempts at reform. So in 2008, there was an attempt to limit and to demand disclosure for any gift beyond $1,000 and to instill a ban on foreign donations altogether. It did not achieve much. In 2010, there was another attempt to do the same, and it met the same destiny. In 2017, there was yet one more attempt. This time it managed now to pass, and I'll say something about it. And in 2019, just last year, there was the application of a second part of the 2018 donation reporting demands. And in a minute, I'll specify what they are. There were also state legislation reforms in Victoria, in Queensland, in New South Wales. All of these did not achieve much, and I think that the reason for this is pretty obvious. Parties need the money. These are competitive creatures who need to continue to fund themselves. And as long as the public is not ready to enlist for that purpose, they will turn to the corporations and to foreigners. So one sign of what is happening here is the continuous scandals. In 2017, if I mention one of them, there was a teapot kind of scandal concerning the supposed great donations of Chinese supported tradesmen and corporations. I think it passed, but in July 2019, we had another scandal in New South Wales where a Chinese businessman simply gave one of the parties in a bag $100,000, left it there and walked away. The money was never reported, of course, and yet the scandal broke out. If I'm looking at Google Trends, the same trends that I explained here concerning the United States, again, before the outbreak of the bushfires, right after the elections, what we find is that 72%, that's less than the United States, but it's very significant, it's absolute majority, associate the federal government with corruption. When people asked, what do parties work for? Is it their own interest or the interest of the voter? In the first time that it was questioned in 2004, 20% argued or declared that it is for their own sake. Last year, that number was 74%. And I would like to just to note the tremendous jump here from 20% to 74%. Put it differently, the image is growing worse and worse. Where does it all meet us now? The COVID-19 did something wondrous all over the world. It stopped both the ability to draw donations from such sources as there are in the United States and in Australia, and it diminished their own ability to donate. The reason is pretty obvious. Who wants to buy coal today when you pay such petty sums for liquid oil, and in periods the price doesn't hold up? It holds up mainly because of taxation. The oil companies can't get rid of it. How much do coal companies have to donate right now? Well, in actual fact, they need government support if they are to survive. The same could be brought concerning everything. International trade, the trade chains that we're discussing. How much do they have when international trade is slowly getting towards a standstill? The aviation companies, the same, airlines. How much can they donate? Well, they can't donate anything. They need government support if they are to survive. The popular image, if it's true or not, that is a different story, but the popular image is that COVID-19 wiped the slate clean. Now you can't rely on external sources such as these to support the government. What then? What do you do? Now, the answer is that we don't know, of course, but there are some signs. The obvious sign is that you can rely on basic propensities of the system, on the, if you want, the political culture of the system. And here there is a big difference between the United States and Australia. Up till now, I mentioned the similarity between them, including the numbers of distrust in the system. Here is the major difference. Australia is a country that was established, if you want, by a state. First, Great Britain, then Australia itself in the 20th century. It was not only the state that established society, it was also the investor of last resort. It developed parts of a country that was far and sparsely populated, and then enabled the private market to enter. In the United States, it's the reverse. The famous slogan, "Go West, young man," in the 19th century, simply defined the situation where you took your horse, you went into the big expanse, empty, so did the colonists believe, empty of human beings, until you found the community of your liking, where you'll settle down because people are like you, and you'll get to do things together. You get things done. And that would mean two things. one, distrust others, and two, trust your local, trust your neighbor. He is the one who is similar to you. He has close interest with you. He'll participate with you. Today, we supposedly can fall down on such past and on such political culture. What does it create? It creates a tendency to engage in centrifugal tendencies in Australia, to overcome, in centrifugal tendencies in the United States, to overcome whatever moves there were that linked the system together, and to dismantle it slowly. Let everybody indeed support his own people, deal with his own neighbors, and don't define from above, so that there will be a trust, at least at the local level, at the governor level, at the mayor level. What about the others who tend to coordinate it? Well, leave them alone. They won't. And if they will, they are afraid that they won't have a good deal of trust. The opposite of that, the centripetal tendencies, are evident in Australia. And that is trust the entirety of a system, overcome the tendencies that united it. They're no longer relevant. And what we've seen here immediately upon that is the institution of a national cabinet. Now, national cabinet or federal authoritarianism, that is sometimes being called, is a thing that most federal systems have. In Australia, it existed for a long, long time, in the United States too. Here, what we meet is a totally different thing. Here we meet a cabinet made of all the executors at the government level and in all the 6 states and territories. And they meet not every month or once a half year, but literally every week. And the consequence of that is something very different than we've seen before. Now, to what degree can we assume that such trends will actually consist and actually persist and actually be seen, not next month, but next year, 2 years? Well, again, we can't predict, but what we could say is that, of course, the question is not new in political science. There was one argument in which Thomas Carlyle was a famous person who said it, that history is simply a gallery of famous portraits. It's the individuals who create history. And therefore, never mind what history tells us, and never mind what experiences tell us, the people at the helm would create the centrifugal, centripetal, whatever it is, whatever order we're coming up with. The opposite assumption is that history creates the person, and that leaders simply act as history permits them. I would tend to say that in all likelihood, what we'll meet is a blend of those. The blend of those would mean that centrifugal tendencies will continue to persist, and I think that everybody who reads today's newspapers could see where it is leading. America is, as a system, in greater and greater trouble. Likewise, in Australia, the centripetal trends will probably persist, and already the question was raised. Now, I know there's going to be an election next year, but nonetheless, the prediction is that it will persist at least after the elections. And that itself tells you the story, because government is being supported by the population. The positions reversed, and later polls, right immediately after the institution of such joint policy, show it, that distrust has reversed. In the United States, distrust deepened. What am I predicting then? I'm not predicting anything. I'm saying that all positions are open and all prophecies are open. But if I were to guess where things are trending, I would guess that the same tendencies will continue. Paradoxically, because both countries have met the conditions which will allow them to overcome the reasons for the diminution of trust and go back to old patterns of yesterday. And here I'd like to stop and invite any questions.
Thank you so much for that, Jonathan. And please, on the Q&A function, feel free to post questions. And I'd just like to note a welcome, Jonathan, from our colleague at the University of Queensland, Graham Moore, a leading scholar in electoral matters and electoral law, has joined us online. So welcome, Graham.
Welcome.
A lot of really salient themes there. And one thing that you might not appreciate, Jonathan, that not only are these themes relevant to contemporary democracy and to Australian democracy, but indeed here in Tasmania, where there's been an active debate about state campaign finance and donation reform. And even on the issue of the democratic accountability of government, there's broad support for the Tasmanian government's response to COVID, but concern about the extent to which Parliament here has been suspended and the lack of parliamentary oversight of the executive. While we're waiting for some questions to come in, I think a comment and a question. I mean, I think your observation about Australia is right, and there is a very real contrast with the US, despite the similarities, that we do have more of a statist culture. We are more comfortable with government. We've got a pragmatic political culture, and I think that's part of the reason why Australians have been reasonably, compliant in terms of the quite, significant and unprecedented, responses to COVID. And obviously the legitimacy of governments, reinforced by the fact that, we have been incredibly effective, as we all know, in terms of at least responding to the public health challenge that we're faced. And now the broader economic, social and political challenge, very much lies ahead. Really specific question around, your area of deep expertise and where you've done so much research and published so widely around campaign finance. Because, in terms of my understanding of the issues, I mean, there's a very clear case for much greater disclosure around donations to political parties. There's probably a case for limiting donations, for limiting spending. The one area that's unclear in my mind is whether there should be public funding of political parties. Because it's one thing that all major political parties agree on. They want a subsidy and a handout. But I kind of sit on the fence on that issue, because I'm not sure that, particularly in the absence of strict regulation about private and corporate donations, it will necessarily reduce political demands for that kind of funding, and therefore, break this really problematic nexus between corporations and the wealthy political parties and our democratic system.
Yeah, so let me just, first of all, pinpoint what I've tried to say and then relate to the question of public funding here. What I've been dealing with here is really perceptions. Most Australians and certainly most Americans don't know the intricacies and don't care about the intricacies of the political finance system. What they do know is that this is not our system. In other words, they represent somebody else. I don't know. I don't care who. That kind of feeling. And the question is really, to what degree does public funding stem such a thing? Now, public funding exists in Australia to a degree. It's minuscule, but it does exist. Did it stem that? No, it did not. On the contrary, it is precisely because there is such a feeling that it's not ours. Why should we pay anything for it? That you're bound to meet resistance against such attempt to extend public funding. And yet, if in a theoretical world in which I could forbid any donations beyond larger sums, and especially the use of public media from parties except that which is given to them from a neutral arbiter, say the public itself, right, through government or through however it is, then in time, I think the issue could be, or the perception could be remediated. This is a system that actually does exist. If you look at a country like Israel, Israel does have private funding, but corporations are not allowed to donate anything whatsoever. Only private individuals, and only till $200, if I'm not mistaken, $250 per person. Once. And you're not allowed to purchase TV, at least. You are given that by government as a proportion of your parliamentary representation. Is that fair? Does it meet the perception problem that I've just mentioned? We can debate both. But I think that a country like Israel suffers from a lot of maladies, does not suffer from the malady that I'm referring to. So here is a combination in which there is a degree of public funding, a degree of private funding, but both of them are limited.
Now, I'd like to thank you, Jonathan. There's an interesting observation that even if we try to resolve some of the issues around the influence of money and in politics, there are plenty of other problems that we also need to attend to. A couple of really good questions coming in. One from Erin, and please don't sit on the fence with this one, but thinking about solutions, you know, what can the government in Australia and the United States do to restore trust? Perhaps even thinking about Australia specifically.
So, in Australia, I think that the government is on the way to restore trust. And I'm sorry that I don't remember the latest polls, but trust has boomed here. And even people who do not intend to vote for the government begin to trust it. So the question that I'm asking myself is, will it continue too much on that road? As we called it, a federal authoritarianism, there is a reason for that name. And the reason is that, of course, you're keeping the parliament and the people away from decision-making. And now, what I'm actually saying is that Australia can, if it persists on the way to that kind of decision-making, will or will not gain trust. And the question is, do Australians bank a lot on maintaining not only the seeming trappings of democracy, but democracy itself? That is, their ability to contribute directly to the decision of critical questions. To put it differently, right now, Australia is on the way to the recovery of trust. I think the question is, how far can it go with that? Where, just like the tightrope walker, where do you stop, right? In the United States, the reverse is in question. I think that what we're seeing here is president that is contributing to the division of the country, mainly because he understands very well that there is no common interest that he could speak to. He needs to maximize the support of his camp. To what degree will this meet a reaction as well, simply by people who would say that we have already lost the most important thing, and that is time for reaction to COVID by such behavior, and that the outcome is a breakdown of the economy and of health, which is really our fault. And to what degree can we stop it? Again, I think it will be stopped, but when?
And sort of part of this is that kind of instrumental view, and colleagues like John Muir have written about that, going back to Australians being pragmatic, that there's always a view that politics requires compromise. Some of it's ethical, a lot of it's not, but as long as governments continue to deliver, people are reasonably confident. Andrew's raised a really good question, and about our innovation coming out of COVID, the National Cabinet, which is a joint committee of the Commonwealth Government and state and territory leaders, yep, but not involving opposition parties. And Andrew's question is, do you think that National Cabinet will result in reduced visibility and accessibilities in terms of the machinations of government? I mean, is this a risk to democracy?
Yeah, so that is exactly what we spoke about. Mm. It's nice to call it a national cabinet, and it's nice to say that the opposition is not represented, but actually then the entirety of the parliament is not represented. Mm. It's not a party cabinet. It's a cabinet of administrators of the state. So it really, what it does is to take over in critical questions the role of Parliament. And as I asked before, to what extent can you keep on doing that? Now, if we're limiting that kind of thing to one single critical question, such as COVID-19, there is, I think, a bonus of trust, and that is because government is still democratic in most things, and there is the state government or territory government and the parties and so forth and so on. But in major issues, there is a negotiations face-to-face between the states and the territories, and they can hammer down a good deal of compromise and understanding between them and themselves. What I'm portraying here, of course, is an authoritarian kind of system in which we have really left the people out. And the question is, how far can it go? So it will work. It does work. And I think that as a consequence, Australia and the United States, that began from a very similar position. I would like to remind one that we began the discussion from a diminution of trust, which was actually in 1%, actually worse in Australia than in the United States. Look at where we are today. We're very different places. I will not guess as the number, but if I will look at the poll and extract from them, I will not be surprised if the confidence in the federal government in the United States is something to the degree of 20%, perhaps a bit less. And in Australia, probably around 70%, perhaps a bit more. This does not mean that people will vote for the parties of the prime minister here or the president there, or the contrary. This is a totally different reflection of what we are talking about. And again, that's an extrapolation from the latest polls that I've seen, I think they belong to last week or the week before. So, but it gives one, I think, some idea of where it's going.
So, I mean, my view on the National Cabinet is clearly in an emergency, it's quite a good mechanism for coordinating the response in a federal system. But the other dynamic that I'm sure you're picking up on, Jonathan, is that financially and fiscally, our federal system's very lopsided. So while you do have the elected leaders of each of the states there, ultimately the Commonwealth's got a lot of financial and political power in those forums. A question from Tilly's just come through. We did touch on this earlier, that I'm naively optimistic about democracy and thinking that perhaps the fact that more democratic and less populist countries tend to have performed better and responded better to COVID-19. But Tilly's asking about the kind of flip side of that, and the question there is, do you think that there's a risk that countries have done well in managing COVID can actually gain trust and then potentially misuse the trust and popularity that they're enjoying on the back of the COVID response?
So, what are the countries that are perceived to have done well? And please note that I'm talking about the perception. Is it true that they've done well? And paradoxically, we're meeting here two countries that at least, or two brands of countries that at least have a claim to have done so. One of them is China. To what extent did it do well? Well, the perception in China is that it has done very well. I think that what we're meeting today sends some questions in our minds as to whether it did or did not. And the fact that the government was afraid to admit and kept it as a secret because it didn't know what will be the general reaction tells us something about the connection between trust and the ability to perform. Other countries are countries like New Zealand, Australia, but I can mention here a country like Germany, a country like Finland. These are democratic countries, but with a very different tradition. And that tradition enabled them to take decisive early measures. This is true of Australia to a large extent, despite the fact that I think that Australia enjoyed other things as well, such as the distance and such as the size factor of the size of the population, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So one wonders if one would have transformed Australia system and its system and replanted in Europe, what would have been, or in America, what would have been the consequence?
I think the geography is important in this, and it's interesting that here in Tasmania, which is a beautiful island with half a million of us on it, usually our challenges are the fact that we're remote and sparsely populated, and fortunately, given the challenges we're facing this year, where those disadvantages have actually turned out to be advantages.
Yeah.
Need to start wrapping up, Jonathan, but one final question from an anonymous question, I dare say from a public servant. And the question is, would it assist with trust if the public service moved to a more frank and fearless model rather than being in the current shadow of politicians? And again, I think COVID's really interesting because there's a bit of a break between those jurisdictions where there's been a lot of political control of the response relative to governments who have really heeded and been quite transparent about following expert advice, whether it's in terms of the public health response from epidemiologists or the economic response from central banks and the like.
Yeah, I'd like to broaden up the question, if I may, and simply point out to one advantage that in Australia has, and that is that Australia always had a professional public service, a bureaucracy. And there is a good deal of trust invested in it. If there was a distrust, it was for the political, not the bureaucracy. One thing that hits you when you travel across Australia, and I've done some traveling, not in this visit, but earlier, is that Australians tend to keep the laws. If you travel across America, and you have done some, you would see that the laws are flexible. People will drive as they seem fit if there's no police around. I've driven here very long distances in Australia. You drive a lot. And what I've seen is that there is nobody on the road, but the signpost says 80 rather than 90, and most people diminish the speed and drive 80. Why is that? Because there is an instinctive kind of belief that people who made it know what they mean. Right? There's a reason for it. It's not just haphazard. A situation where there is belief in the public administration also encourages belief in the scientists, in the administrators, in short, in what you find here. The typical situation in a country like the United States is that there is a relative lack of belief in science, and indeed we have a president who's trying exotic medicines in himself, and who has prognostications, because who cares about science? He knows the best because he is the leader of the tribe. I don't think that this is a situation in Australia, and I think that such a situation will have to meet a disaster unless remedied in the United States.
Right. Thank you, Jonathan. We do need to conclude. Thank you so much for those insights, really on the most profound issues that we're grappling with. We really appreciate that, and I'd like to thank everyone who's tuned in, and there are certainly quite a large number of you to tonight's lecture. So please join me, albeit silently, in thanking Jonathan. My only regret is that, well, you and your wife, Jonathan, are going to be here in Australia with us until the end of August. I guess there's still a slim chance that you can visit us here in Tasmania. If that's not possible this year, I hope that it is possible in the not too distant future. So thank you so much for—
Let me join that hope, and thank you and the university for hosting me.